A Christmas feast. He first suspected that they were going to eat him when he noticed a distinct lack of Yuletide smells. It wasn't perhaps a conscious thought, at least not the one which had been fully released, but there was a clear growing uneasiness within him. Somehow he just knew. Surely if a family invited you for Christmas dinner, the house would be filled with the most wonderful aromas associated with the annual feast. Roasted turkey, honey-glazed vegetables, perhaps views of mulled wine or brandy-covered Christmas pudding. But no, all of these were absent. Yet the table was set. It was a particularly bleak Christmas, and while snow was often welcome at the festive time of year, the penetrating cold and frost which seemed to be sabotage both homes and the residents' bodies was not. The temperature had plummeted on the 7th, and there had been little sign of any forthcoming reprieve. Families attempted as best they could do to reach one another, but for many it was to be a lonely Christmas day. Travel, especially for the elderly, was almost impossible for fear of slipping on the ice. One fall was all it would take for a broken hip or shoulder, and for the most fragile individuals amongst them, recovering from such an injury was not an easy task. Certainly not as easy as it would be for those of younger vintage. The Cardinal family had taken a pity of the elderly gentleman who had recently moved into the neighborhood, only a few streets away. They were of an upstanding stock and took part of a local home help initiate spending time with the old and vulnerable. Everyone knew and loved them. Timmy was the youngest, a boy of only 5 or 6. He was a child whom all looked upon with great adoration, never complaining, never causing trouble. Always adorable, and his 10-year-old sister, Camilla, was equally as admired. They were both testaments to the caring and nurturing parent skills of Ben and Lucy Cardinal. Each year, as the cold winter drew in, the Cardinal family were admired for the dedication and commitment for those around them. The passion, almost zeal for helping those who were less fortunate. But behind the smiles of the skin-deep facade of that of a loving family lurked a far more sinister purpose. They had a tradition each year, a way to reward themselves for their kindness and generosity, one which stemmed back through many previous generations of the Cardinal family. Each Christmas, they would invite a guest for dinner who would be welcomed with open arms into their home, sat down at a beautifully set table, provided with humorous and enjoyable Christmas conversations, and then by the light of the roaring fire, the guests would be stabbed to death and eaten gracefully. They all revealed in the old tradition, with Timmy looking forward to in the most. He had a ferocious appetite and a waistline to match it. The children to get so wrapped up in the anticipation of a family Christmas, and his parents were delighted to see a growing boy fill his belly. Camilla was a more quiet disposition than her stout little brother, slight of a figure with a pallid complexion which reminded all of her mother, but made no mistake. She adored eating with her family and could render anyone silent with a sharp, cold insult. Ben was with the local police chief for the area, so covering up their annual feast was quite the cinch, while Lucy was, shall we say, a relation of sorts and was entirely enthusiastic about maintaining the Christmas tradition. Their guests were invariably those without family, and often of a ripe old age, forgotten by society, left to wither in their isolated little houses. Ben explained to the children yearly that if it was almost a kindness to put the victims out of their slowly increasing misery, and besides, when they did eventually die, they would be shoved into a box in the ground or roasted into ashes. What a waste of a good meat! This year, Timmy and Camilla were especially excited. It was all their mother could do to calm their nerves. But on that Christmas Eve, it was nearly impossible, for they knew the Christmas treat they were in for the following day. The Cardinals were hosting the most special guest. His name was Sergiu Moraru, and he hailed from Eastern Europe. They had never had a foreign meal before, and the very idea of tearing into some delicious exotic muscle and fat made this year's feast something to look forward to. They had met the old man Moraru just a few weeks earlier, when Ben had noticed the unusual name on his home help list. Each year, as the Christmas approached, the volunteers at the local church would be given names and addresses of pensioners in the area who had no family and would be left quite alone for the holiday season. At the festive time of the year, I'm worried that many of the frailer residents might succumb of the biting cold. Church committee members would visit each of the lonely individuals and offer a friendly ear and help a hand, and offer some hearty food to the poorest of those on the list. The names would rarely change, but at least a person on the list would sadly pass away that year. Being an upstanding member of the community and a high-ranking police officer in the area, Ben would often inform the church that one of their flock had sadly passed away, and with no friends or family known, he would concoct a lie which usually involved a long-lost son or daughter appearing to take their sadly departed parents somewhere far away to be buried. That, or he would say that they had simply moved, having a bit of a deal with the local estate agent and solicitors firm to throw the proceeds from any property sales their way. The family were not without influence. It was incredible how little people questioned this, but as the Cardinals ensured that each Christmas meal was not an active member in the church or community, people just assumed that Ben knew best. This year the Cardinals had been hoping to invite Lucy around for her Christmas swan song, but unfortunately she had died during the summer. Ben had investigated, as he suspected that the intruder had been inside the house with her at the time of her death, but it seemed as though the causes were neutral. No, the family would just have to someone differ for dinner. Then the name appeared on the list. Sergio Moraru, age 86. Slight emphysema, no family. Knows no one in the area as he has only recently moved here. Ben found that Mr. Moraru to be an absolute delight. While he was obviously very frail, his mind was still sharp as he regaled Ben with numerous colorful stories about the old country and the adventures he had while in the full bloom of youth. Of particular interest were his war stories, and Ben was thrilled to know that their main cause was to be that of an intelligent, well-traveled man. He even looked unlike any of the previous victims. He was quite tall, although slightly hunched with age, and with a long crooked nose and intense stare, Ben fancied that in his youth Moraru would have been quite intimidating. His kind smile and obvious fragile frame, however, left Ben in no doubt that the kids would love him. They enjoyed eating those with character and gentle disposition. He always enjoyed the meat more if it had a keen mind and if it was out of the ordinary, as the family religion, one which had managed to stay unseen yet influential throughout the centuries, stated that the eating of another human being without transmits some of its strength to those whom devoured it. As with many of those who can only look into the past rather than into the future, Sergio Moraru enjoyed the company greatly, and was touched when Ben invited him to sit at the family's Christmas table. The old man was extremely frail, and required the assistance of both Ben and Camilla to help him in and out of Ben's car, and then into the house. His emphysema was particularly bad that day, as each step, accompanied by the wheezing, fluid-filled sounds of struggling lungs. Each room of the Cardinal house was draped by a multicolored selection of rather crass Christmas decorations, with numerous cards adorning every visible table, and the mantelpiece showing just how popular Ben and his family really were. The table was beautifully laid with red cotton cloth, resting underneath an elegant cream dining set. The old man found that the rest of Ben's family were just as pleasant and congenial as he was. Timmy and Camilla were kind and very well behaved for their age, helping the frail old man to his chair carefully and then waited on him, topping up his drink as their mother and father busied themselves in the kitchen. Finally, Lucy appeared carrying a huge centerpiece plate. It was unusually large, and as she sat in the middle of the table, empty and devoid of food, Old Man Moraru caught a look on Lucy's face. It was brief, as he immediately attempted to disregard it as a product of his imagination, but it unsettled him deeply. It was as if a private joke had been passed between the eyes of Lucy and her children, flickered a grin, and not one of kindness or of a Christmas spirit, but rather one resembling that of a bully, as if Sergio was the unwitting recipient of some unwholesome prank waiting to be ridiculed. Just as the unease began to damage, Ben appeared with large jagged carving knife and a long two-pronged fork, which reminded Sergio more of a butcher's implement than that required to cut a decent-sized turkey. A turkey which became increasingly conspicuous by its absence. There they sat for over an hour, each member of the cardinal family, replenishing the old man's drink with enthusiasm and showing concern for every and each cough or moment of uncomfortable breathing experienced by their guest. But it was strange concern. There they sat gleefully, asking Moraru questions and then listening to the stories and answers which came about his life, where he had lived, how many battles he had fought. But the interest and concern seemed to be distant somehow. It was only skin deep. Each time their guest mentioned the old country, those same conspiracy-laden glances were traded across the table, as if excited, not by the content of the stories, but rather by a simple fact that Moraru was a foreigner. The absence of not only the food, but that of a mere mention of it was unsettling enough. But what was more perplexing was that Ben repeatedly stole looks towards the antique clock, which sat on a mantelpiece above the fire. Looks which were poorly hidden and betrayed their purpose. He was counting down the minutes to some event. While the old man had no idea what the event was, the certainty was apparent that it was not connected to anything cooking in the kitchen oven. Moraru knew that there was simply no food being roasted, grilled, or even cooled on a window ledge nearby. Whatever was planned, it was not going to involve him eating Christmas meal. It was Camilla who stopped smiling first at his historical observations. She had ceased listening. No longer was she politely laughing at the obvious jokes and the endearing sight of the old man, repeating himself through forgetfulness. Camilla was simply staring with those pinpoint cold dark eyes, as a snake before the strike. Timmy was the next to abandon the act as he began to grin at Sergio. As his hands gripped a small, serrated steak knife intensely, the most alarming thing was that the focus on Timmy's stare was not the old man's face, but his wrinkling neck. With one last glance at the clock, Ben ceased being juvenile, attentive host and began to run his fingers along the huge carving knife in front of him, with a mixture of anger and lust upon his face. Sergio had seen many things in his time, but nothing as surprisingly strange and unnerving as this. Finally, when the clock began to chime, Lucy relinquished her false, endearing shell and exposed the cold-hearted and twisted personality which lay beneath. As the chimes slowly rang throughout the house, one by one, echoing lonely and piercing their symbolism, each of the cardinals rose up from their chairs, sharp, jagged knives in hand, and waited. The chime rung once more and uttered the independable praise and the unisson. The chime rang twice, and they increased the cult-like chorus of various city and volume. The chime rang 3 times, and then they stopped. As they were silent, the house devoid of sound, Christmas spirit and that of hope. The old man's wheezing grew intensely and unquietly. The bizarre sight of the twisted family about to dine dawned upon Sergio. The family then quietly and essentially walked around the dining table and stood motionless, surrounding their guest. Just as the old man was about to inquire what was become of him, the clock on the mantelpiece burst into life one final time. The chime was different from the others. It was sharper, somewhat fuller, and echoed once, and once only, throughout the cardinal home. From behind, Lucy slit the old man's throat, from ear to ear, as Ben thrust his carving knife deep into Sergio's stomach. Both parents then removed their knives and stood back, waiting to pry as Camilla cut and stabbed repeatedly. But Timmy thrust his steak knife in and out of Mararu's legs, neck and arms. After a few minutes, the frenzy diminished, and both children grew tired, and with one last downward thrust, Timmy drove the steak knife so deeply into the old man's hand that it was skewered and completely and buried itself into the table on which the hand rested. The children now ran to their parents' collective embrace. They hugged and rejoiced in what was a fantastic Christmas game, and now could look forward with a delight to some succulent exotic meal. Arms wrapped around one another, they staring at their victims and began to laugh loudly, commenting on the old fool stories of times gone by, the war in the old country. As they turned to each other, once more, the laughter diminished as they looked into each other's rosy, blood-covered faces and shared a family moment. This has been one of Ben's favorite sacrifices. But the laughter had not completely ceased. One person was still laughing loudly. Confusion turned to the abject horror as the bizarre truth revealed itself. It was Mr. Mararu, sitting covered in blood, his head tilted back, and a deep cut in his throat wide open. The dinner guest laughed loud and strong, a laugh which was both young and old. His head arced towards as he pulled Timmy's steak knife out of his hand, dropping it on the floor. Camilla screamed as Lucy hid behind Ben. What did thought to be a corpse now stared at them all, as they had stared at it with a singular purpose. Timmy began to pee himself as he cried two previously retracted fangs cracked throughout the old man's upper gum, revealed a staggering and terrifying grin. As he rose to his feet, Lucy fainted, and with both hunched and age now gone, the cardinal guest loomed tall and dark before them, his eyes piercing, telling tales of the countries and decades and of centuries of existence. Sergio Mararu ate well that Christmas.